by marrying an Egyptian. They find out both of us converted, and then the big question is why? Why would you convert to something so much more difficult than what you were coming from? So this is how we started telling our story.
It's the kufta. As Protestants, we had hot dogs at the barbecues, and we found kufta. Okay, so we give a talk about our conversion that normally runs about an hour 45 with a PowerPoint. So obviously, what we're going to offer is completely insufficient, but when this is over, we will stay as long as you have questions to answer them. We have no clock. So what we're going to first do is give a very brief synopsis of how we ended up here. And I think especially with a comparative religions series starting, I think it's important because I think we probably represent the majority of people you will encounter that are religious seekers that aren't Coptic already, they're going to be from the evangelical Christian world, and that's where we came from. So I grew up in a very dysfunctional, poor area, and the Mormon Church was able to step in and really help our family. And so my mom entered into the Mormon Church where I was raised, and some years later I left and became an atheist for a number of years, and then became an evangelical Christian, and then became serving at a very large nationally televised church where I ran the seating for special events and for the main service. And I'm going to fast forward, I'm skipping a whole lot, but then began a study of apologetics and began really in earnest to look at defending our faith. And the best place I found to learn apologetics was back then, if you were older, you remember MySpace, and they had religion and philosophy debate forums, and it was a hornet's nest of brilliant atheists. And virtually everyone I'd ever met had been a former evangelical Christian, every one of them. And so if you want to know where's the weakness in my belief system, they'll be more than happy to teach you. And they did. And so every time they'd bring challenges, I'd go research, I'd come back and respond. And this went on for a couple of years. I debated some other religions to kind of see. It was a tool for me because it told me what do I need to know about my own faith by going to the most harsh critics. And it enabled me to find out how consistent are other faiths with offering objective, testable evidences, with defending their beliefs through observation, and how do they apply to reality as we see it, and at the same time, what do they offer that's falsifiable in their claims. If you'll notice, 99% of the people you meet believe what they believe because they like it. Honestly, you were all born into the Coptic Church, and probably most of you have never really studied any criticisms of your faith from outsiders who say it may not be true, and you pretty much just are walking in the cultural inheritance you have. And frankly, you have people in Egypt from the Muslim faith that are doing the same thing. They're not questioning theirs either. They're kind of just taking what they were inherited. Now we believe, thank God, what you inherited is objectively true, and I believe we can offer a very compelling case for it. But most people believe what they believe because it appeals to them. And we had come to discover as Protestants that if what I believe is based upon what appeals to me, what I'm going to construct is a deity, a God, who looks exactly like I do. Because everything he likes is what I like. And so I felt that worshiping in front of a mirror was not safe because I'm going to die one day. And when that day comes, how am I going to save myself if I've been worshiping myself? So this was just a very fundamental tenet as a Protestant that I was applying in trying to be as objective as I could in finding out what is true. And so kind of fast forward, we'd studied apologetics, and we began teaching a college group. And in this college group, we were meeting on Friday nights for 3 hours every week in a discussion format. And then when that would end, we'd usually go back to our place for 3 more hours. And college kids, 6 hours every Friday, because we're engaging and talking, we're not standing and lecturing. And this led to one of the people asking a question: how did we get our Bible? I mean, here, we as Protestants, and when I say Protestant, understand that is way too broad a term to really describe anything meaningfully, because the difference between an Anglican and a non-denominational evangelical is huge. So I'm really overly generalizing because I have to for the sake of discussion here, but it's very broad. So we're now teaching this group, theology and apologetics, and yes, how do we get our Bible? Well, being sola scriptura, Bible alone is the final authority, like all evangelicals and Protestants, we didn't even know how we got it. It was something that you kind of presume fell from heaven one day, and now you're holding it. And so this young lady had asked the question, and I had a book by a world-renowned scholar, F.F. Bruce, that I had acquired along with the whole library I had acquired when debating apologetics, and I'd never read it. And so I handed it to her, and I said, here, you go read it and give us a teaching. And she handed it back after a couple of months and said, I can't. Well, you do it. So I took about 3 months, and I went through the book several times, and highlighting, and then noting, and then putting together a teaching that took 18 hours to teach. 3 hours a night, 6 nights, 32 pages of handouts with maps and all this information. Well, a couple of things happened in that study. One was there was one city that really jumped out through this study, and this was, among other things, the place where there was a letter written, and it contained the first list of the books of the Bible that we hold today. The first person to write that list, and as it turns out, it wasn't Jesus that gave us the list of the books of our Bible. It actually happened several hundred years later. And how many people here know what that letter was that we wrote, that we read? Okay, well, you should. You really should, because it was written by St. Athanasius the Apostolic, and it was in 367 AD, and it was what was called a festal letter. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the world. So every year, since Easter fell on the cyclical calendar, not on the normal calendar, but actually by the cycle of the moon and the sun and so on, they needed the world's greatest astronomers to decide what does that fall on this year, and when you needed an intellectual question like that answered, you turned to Alexandria. So the Alexandrian Pope every year would write a letter, and it's called a festal letter, to tell us when the feast is. And in this letter, he may take the time to address some other issue going on in the churches. In 367 AD, he addressed this question of what books are the authoritative books, and that's the first list we find. So Alexandria really stuck in my mind, not just for that reason. It was the first catechetical school in the world, the first monasteries. I mean, it was they say, like Jerusalem was a birthplace of Christianity, but really Alexandria was kind of the cradle for the baby of Christianity, and for quite some period of time. And in this study, I came across St. Athanasius, St. Irenaeus, and he struck me hard, because St. Irenaeus was a disciple under Polycarp, who was a disciple under John the Apostle. We're talking very early. And he wrote around 188 AD, and he was writing to battle a Gnostic heresy, because this was the real threat against the church in his time, were the Gnostic believers. And they claimed there was a secret teaching that came to them through the apostles that the other ordinary, regular people just weren't ready for and couldn't handle. So it was given secretly. Well, St. Irenaeus said, his argument was to me so sublime, and just, it's like this light bulb went on. He said, go to any church founded by the apostles. If they're going to give their truth, something crucial to anybody, It's going to be to the bishops they chose to lead the congregations. And it's going to be in the congregations they themselves spent years establishing. They didn't write a letter and say, okay, go start a church over here with this letter. They went and lived with them for years. They trained them personally. So he said, go look all over the world wherever an apostle established a congregation. And what you're going to see is that they all speak in the same voice. They all believe the same thing as each other. And you'll also see that what they believe, they've never heard of these Gnostic beliefs. How is it they've never heard of them? This is where the apostles established churches and chose the bishops. Then he said, now look at the writings, because remember this was in the canon of Scripture. And he was saying, look at the writings that they hold and see if anybody in those churches has ever heard of these Gnostic writings. They'll look at them and say, we don't know what this is. So this, to me, was profound. You're in America, we're in America. We have as many churches as we do coffee shops, more churches than liquor stores. I mean, it's like on every corner. In case you haven't noticed, it's the American model of I'm going to compete and take the business from my customer because I think I can provide a better service at lower prices. And so we actually find, if you track the history of Protestantism, the better service, lower prices model continuing. It became, well, okay, now you just, instead of baptismal repentance and everything, now you can just come forward and say a prayer at an altar. It's called an altar call, and it was invented in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Charles Finney, I think, and the squirming seat up front is a whole story. But basically, you can just come up and say a prayer, and now you're guaranteed heaven. So here I'm offering you lower prices. And then that became, well, no, tell you what, you can stay in your seat and raise your hand and say the prayer with us. And then it became, okay, everybody close your eyes and put your head down so nobody feels uncomfortable to raise their hand. And tell them about the recent one that you came across.
Oh, I recently came back from a trip, and then I work at a Protestant ministry, and they were so excited about people who had come to accept Christ, and all you had to do was text in your response. If you wanted to receive Jesus, just text this number and you can receive Christ.
You can't make that up. I mean, that's pretty good. Just text it in. I mean, I'd like to do that with confession sometimes. So anyway, we come from this background, and all of these different competing churches, and mind you, most of the time, it's very sincere. They believe they want a welcoming environment. They want you to feel comfortable. It's very much because they want to connect you with what they believe is true. There's no ill intent, I believe, in almost any of the cases. However, things do move into this kind of consumer-friendly pattern. And so everybody's saying ours is the authentic belief system. Ours is authentic Christianity. And believe me, we had studied a lot, and I spent a lot of time studying. I was a very knowledgeable Protestant. I can talk to you about Lutheran or Calvinist or non-denominational theologies. But here I found this test in St. Irenaeus that I said, this is it. This is the answer. What did those early communities believe? And so I applied what I consider to be a methodology I received from St. Irenaeus. By the way, that's my baptismal name. That's why I'm probably the only Irenaeus in the Coptic Church. But he is one of our saints. We just don't mention him because somehow he became a Latin father. I don't know why, but truly the man had a very broad encounter because he came, from Polycarp in Smyrna in Turkey and was very close to them in Rome where he'd studied, and he was a bishop clear over in France. So very broad understanding. So I decided, okay, whatever I find when I start looking at what the early Christians believed in these writings from the early Christians, whatever I find that's believed the same in all the churches, that's what's authentically Christian. Now, here's the thing, if you get nothing else tonight that I want you to get. I applied this methodology before I looked at the data. Before I looked at what they said, I said, this is the way to know, which means I will conform to what I find. If I find what they all believed is something doesn't agree with me, too bad for me. I have to comply with it because this is what was handed down. This is what's authentically Christian. And so with this in mind, I began a historical study, and I said at the same time, I know there's this one branch of Christianity I know nothing about, Orthodoxy, and it's a very early form, and that might be a good place to start learning things while I'm also doing an independent historical study to see what these early Christians have said. And so there was this building that I saw, and on the side it said Alexandria. And it had said, like the Diocese of Alexandria on St. John. And of course, you can't miss this building, it's huge. But it was that word that caught me. And I said, that's where I'm going to go. That's where I'm going to go learn this. And I walked up. I was new, I didn't know better, and I've repented since, but I showed up on time. And they forgave me, and I've learned to show up later. And I meet Abuna Daniel out on the steps of the church, and I tell him what I'm here to do. I'm here to study and to learn about the early church, and I'll never forget our exchange. I'm sure it was different to him, but he said, well, stay a while and see how you like it. And I said, how I like it is utterly irrelevant to anything. If I absolutely love it and it's not true, I'm going to leave. And if I absolutely hate it, but it is true, I have to conform to it. And it's that simple. Honestly, there is no false advertising here. When you're in the nave looking up at the sanctuary, what's top dead center? Is that a birthday cake? Is that a party hat? Is that fireworks? Or is that a cross? Well, there's no false advertising here. It's a cross. So it's our place to conform to the truth, not to go pick and find pieces of truth that we like, that we can adapt into our lives. You have to be willing to comply and bend with it. So this was the first approach, walking up to St. John.
All right. This is what we do as husband and wife. No, you. We learned this from the Egyptians. No, you first. You go. You go. Happy, go.
I call it Egyptian wrestling, and then it gets to the point where they're shoving each other. It's really fun to watch.
Okay, well, his first time at St. John was not my first time. I was still at home that day, and he went with a couple of friends that were really interested in just kind of taking in the experience. Now, mind you, I was used to 45-minute Protestant services. This is how long it was. Well, now it's 2 hours, and I'm ready for breakfast, and I haven't heard from him yet. So I text him, and I say, where are you? And he says, church is still going on. And it's 2 hours. I'm like, holy church services, Batman. That's a long time. So I came the following week, and just to see what this was all about, because he came home. If you're going to have me speak, you're going to regret it. He came home, and he had the biggest man crush on this Abuna Daniel Habib. He just thought he was the greatest thing, and he was so sweet. And if you knew him before, sweet would not be the way to describe this man. He was rough around the edges, and he still is a little bit, but he had this air about him that I had to see for myself what this was all about. Now, mind you, when I came into the sanctuary, my Protestant spidey senses were tingling, because I had been mostly in venues like this, or in warehouses, or in places with smoke machines and with lights and guitars, and so I come in and there's
Not this kind of smoke machine, by
the way. Yes, in our church now, the smoke machine is the censer, and the special lighting are the candles. But so I walk in, and my spidey senses are tingling, because to me this looks very Catholic, and I'm very anti-Catholic as a Protestant. I see beautiful chandeliers, I see gaudy red carpet, I see, oh my goodness, I see people kissing the priest's hand. I thought I was going to die. I'm like, No, that's not happening. Fist bump. Psh, all right, what's up? So, what was really wonderful was I had a gal, Mariam Yosef, come and sit with me, and she started to talk me through the liturgy. Now, this is where I really, really encourage you. If you want to be an outreach church, if you want to be an evangelistic church and minister to people, look for somebody that looks completely out of place, that looks lost what's going on. They don't know when to sit, they don't know when to stand. Someone told me it's like getting pulled on stage with Beyonce to dance. What am I like? I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. So if it hadn't been Mariam, there wouldn't have been a second time for me. I can tell you that. So like I said, this gaudy red carpet, she then tells me, well, this red carpet is because it represents the blood of Christ and the blood of the saints. And I didn't know that. In our churches, it was like, was it going to be the steel gray, or was it going to be the spring teal, and it was going to be a fist fight over what color carpet we were going to have, and the pastor's wife wins over all. So if it hadn't been for her sitting with me, like I said, I wouldn't have come back. And then I learned so much about what the meaning of the censer was, and the meaning of the chandeliers even, and every single thing had such deep meaning. It was really great. And then I think I'll let you take it from here.
Well, when I first walked in, the first thing that struck me and just picture this, I've never been in one before, you guys are so used to it. The first thing that struck me was that the priest was not facing me. There was no usher, there was no greeter, nobody welcomed me, nobody greeted me, and nobody was facing me. There's symbolism that I understand, because I'm human. I get it when I see it. You don't even have to tell me why. And I knew what this meant. It meant that I'm not a customer here. It meant God's the center of attention. God is center front. That altar isn't 4 feet to the left or 4 feet to the right. It's in the middle. And the lecterns, where you will read and speak, those are not in the center between taking the place. Nothing is in the center but God, the altar. When I'm going to speak, when somebody's going to speak, it's over here. God stays in the middle, and I'll speak from over here, because that's his place, it's not mine. That nobody's looking at me or facing me. It's all directed at God. And then when somebody goes to read or whatever, I know that's directed at me, because you're facing me. And I know exactly what things are for me and what things are given over and pointing to God. This was the first thing that struck me, and it struck me beautifully. You probably aren't aware, but most of what you see in non-denominational evangelical Christianity actually has a root that goes back to a place called Willow Creek. And you've probably never heard of it. Willow Creek was going to begin a church, and so they hired a market research team. And they did their homework. They were good. And from the color of the carpet, to the design of the interior, to the type of seating, to the coffee shop in the building, to everything was completely market researched to the letter. And then they opened the doors, and it exploded. It worked. It was the first mega church in America, and it was so impressive, and the numbers were so huge of the people coming in that all the other churches began to copy the model, because it worked. And then you had numerous mega churches. One of them was where I was running seating for the televised, the recorded for television service. And there are 1,000 logistical issues you would never even imagine involved in that. But this is the model that they all started to follow after Willow Creek. Well, what most people, even who maybe know the story, don't know is that Willow Creek repented. They repented of this. They said, we did all this to increase accessibility and numbers, and we did, but what we lost were the disciples. The hardcore disciples left and went somewhere else. So they're looking to cater to the most marginal, kind of indifferent people by giving them something fun or different, but you're catering everything to this group that really doesn't seem to care that much anyway, but the real disciples seeking weren't getting anything. And if any of you are friends and have connections in the evangelical world like I do, you'll see there's a movement. And it's a pretty one-directional movement. And it's from non-denominational fun churches to earlier, more fundamental Calvinist, Lutheran, traditional churches, because they're looking for something holy, not fun. They're looking for something substantial, something meaningful and deep, and something with some degree of intelligence, because what they're getting fed are Twinkies and Ho-Hos, which are delicious, but at some point, I need some vegetables, and I need something of substance. And so they're kind of moving over in this direction. Then the people from those churches, Lutheran, Calvinist and stuff, they're looking for something even more rich, deep, and connecting them back to the early church, and they're moving into Orthodoxy. Now, we as a Coptic church are not the places they're going. That's why we stand out as such an anomaly, that we didn't marry an Egyptian, and we studied our way in. We're not here because we liked it. We're here because we believe orthodoxy is objectively true. And then there's a second question, which you need to understand is a second question, is Coptic. Coptic and orthodoxy are not the same thing. When we decided orthodoxy was true, we had a choice of flavor. There was an Antiochian church near us that was a Protestant church. The whole thing converted, pastor and all. And the pastor became a priest, and the whole congregation converted. We would have been very much at home there. There's Greek, great food too, like you guys. There's Russian with incredible scholarship. There's all these options to us. We don't have to choose the Coptic church. But we chose the Coptic church for a reason, and we can talk about that later if you want. But my point is, there is that which is Orthodox and that which is Coptic, and they're not synonymous. And if you want to know which is which, go look at all the other Orthodox churches. If they share it with you, that's Orthodox. If they don't, that's Coptic. And that's okay. I'm not saying Coptic isn't good. We chose Coptic. I mean, it was, we weren't born in it. We picked it. But understand, that's not the same as Orthodox. So you don't impose and demand and require Coptic of somebody wanting to enter the church, because it's the Orthodox church. They're not here, you don't demand that they conform to Egyptian culture or Egyptian standards. Now, mind you, we love it. What we found conveyed in just this gesture, there's 5 minutes of conversation and embrace and love and welcome and respect conveyed in this. It's the most beautiful gesture. We have nothing this good in America. And when you do this, there's so much conveyed there. And if I had to boil down the Coptic Spirit to one thing, that would be it. Because it says, we accept all things coming from the hand of God, the good and the bad. What we receive comes from God, and what we don't receive. And what it really defines is a spirit of humility in practice, not just in gesture or word, but in practice. When something great happens, thank God, it was the will of God. When something horrible happens, thank God, that was the will of God. And you humbly submit to it. So what I'm getting at is there are things, we absolutely love Coptic, but you don't impose them and force them and conflate them with what is Orthodox. Coptic is not synonymous with Orthodox. Some things are, some things aren't. And what I'd really want more than anything, if there's one thing to take away, it's that when any question comes up, I don't care what it is, my wife and I, the way we came here, I would want to see the whole Coptic church approach every question that arises, all of them, in the same way. And it starts with a simple premise. You're not the first Christian, Habibi. There are 2,000 years of Christians that came before you showed up on this planet. So when a question arises, don't look at yourself and say, gee, what do I think? How do I like that? Does that really? No, I think that would do this. no, that's not the starting place. There's a time to look at your own sensitivity, cultural sensitivities, and other questions. But the starting place is to realize if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, if that happened as a historical event, then he proved he was God. That's settled, he's God. What did he say? He said, listen to these guys. Do what they tell you. And they were the apostles. And he said, the point of salvation history, the point of God's work from the fall of man till the resurrection of Christ was that they be one, as you and I are one, and they in me, and I in them, and I in you, and that I will send my Spirit, and he will dwell in you, and unite you to me and to one another. Well, if that actually happened, if he accomplished that goal, then when a question arises, what I want to know is not what do I think. What I want to know is what has the Spirit already said on the matter? Has the Spirit spoken at all? Well, where will I hear the voice of the Spirit if that actually occurred? If the Spirit of God entered into humanity, where does that Spirit reside in humanity? It's in the church, which again, I will remind you, does not mean the Coptic Church. It means the church, Orthodox. All the Orthodox churches, all the apostolically established churches, which means my first question is, what has the Spirit said on the matter? Or has he spoken on the matter? So I'm going to look now, what have all the churches founded by the apostles said on the matter? What is something close I can find to kind of match the situation that might give me some information? Now, this isn't the end, this is the beginning of inquiry. This is the beginning of the question. But this is the crucial beginning because it takes you out of the place of being the decider and determiner of truth and puts you into being the discoverer of truth. You're the one now seeking to find what's true, not to decide what's true. And so now you go and you start looking. What have all the churches spoken since the beginning? And you're looking at the patristics. And you're looking for what was spoken early and what was sustained, because this is all historically, I liken this to a choir, and a very simple song is sung. And then somebody else comes in and they want to add another chorus or another line or another verse to this song. And they start singing it. But then the rest of the choir has to respond. Because remember, the Spirit dwells in the whole church, not in one person. So now this person says, I believe this is the Spirit, and he starts singing another line. And the rest of the choir says, no, that's a sour note. That does not belong in this song. And they reject it. Or they say, that's it. That exactly fits. That's beautiful. Let's bring that line into the song. And they embrace it. Or it could be like Gregory of Nyssa, where he brings in things that are beautiful and match, but then this one note is like this thing, this sour note, and they say, he's still one of us. He brought in a sour note. We leave that note out, and we accept the rest. So we're looking to what this choir has sung because you're handed a song to sing that came from before you. And if there is a need to address something, to sing another note, to add a line to that chorus, you need to start by going back and looking for what they have sung before you. And you need to look at what all the others have sung in this situation, both before you and recently and in all the Orthodox churches. And if you find there's now no unanimous voice, there's a lot of different opinions, you find universality even in the diversity. For instance, we used historically the Alexandrian text of the New Testament. The Eastern Orthodox used the received text, the Latin Textus Receptus. Ours is a little more small, it's a little more compact New Testament, and the other is a little more expanded. There are explanations that that I think make the most sense, that say that's because it's more likely you would add something in to give more clarity from one of the other Gospels into this Gospel because you know it's true and you want to expand it a little more for the reader. Makes much more sense, especially knowing Eastern people, than to say, no, they just removed something. So, but my point is, Here we have two kind of different textual traditions, but we look at each other and say, yours is a valid, legitimate Bible, and the others look back and say, yours is a valid, legitimate Bible. So what is universal? That we affirm each other. Even if there's difference, there's a universal. So this is what I'm saying, is to go look at what those before you have said, and sometimes there is room to move, there's room to be flexible, and other times it's very firm. But this is the starting point to get us out of this place of looking to ourselves as the source of truth and realize there are 2,000 years that came before us.
All right. Well, to take us back to our story, we've talked about a number of things already that we absolutely loved about the church. And not to say the least is the history, the richness, the fact that it's established by St. Mark. The background that I come from the evangelical background, it's like, our church is so old, it was established in 1972. And that's old in the Protestant world. And so I'd be visiting this church, and I'm like, I'm going to this church that was established by Mark. And they'd be like, oh, that's great. Mark who? Mark Driscoll, no, the Mark. And so there's the richness of it. There is the fact that it is one church where, growing up again in the Protestant evangelical church, we talked about the church as a whole, but pretty much it was always, we want our church to be better than the other one down the street. When people come in here, we want them to feel warm and welcomed. We want them to feel like family. We want to love on them. We want it to be like no other church that they've ever been to. So again, it wasn't acting, though, as one church. And then that's something I discovered here, is it really is one church. If it's not for the Spirit alone, it's for the fact that all of you guys are all cousins. I found that everybody is related to everybody. I love it. I think Tilo and I
had a friend who said, hey, that guy there is related to the Pope. He's a friend of mine, American. And I'm like, dude, we are the only two people in this room that aren't related to the Pope.
So we really, there were so many things that we loved, and we can't even convey them all. And I just want to convey some of the simplest ones. Honestly, when I see you moms holding your little babies, and your little Egyptian babies with their long dark eyelashes and their brown skin and their gorgeous eyes, or even when they're running amok across the floor, I can't help but look and wonder, is this what our Lord looked like? Because this beautiful Middle Eastern brown eyes, it's just, it really strikes me, sometimes to the point of tears, because it's just like we forget that our Jesus, God incarnate, became a man, and he grew up in Nazareth, and he played. And so you got to wonder, is this what he looked like? And so here are some of the wonderful, wonderful things that we loved about coming into this church. But at the same time, reminding you that I started going to a Protestant church when I was 5, and I started coming here when I was in my early 40s. So it was that long that I had been taught against many of the things that are traditions here in the Coptic church. Now, not just not taught about it or taught, this is a different expression, but literally taught against it. So here we are coming into it, and you have, say, confession. Well, we could just say, well, in the Protestant church, we don't have confession, we have small group, we have accountability groups. But you can't say that, because if I'm bringing my confession to a priest, in the evangelical Protestant church, they would say, there is one mediator between God and man, and that is Christ Jesus alone. So to put a priest between you and God and say that what Christ did on the cross is not enough is a heresy. It is an abomination. So, and I don't have time to resolve that. If anyone wants to resolve that, they can stick around later. But the intercession of the saints, it's in the book of Deuteronomy, and I think Leviticus, that you're not supposed to talk to dead people. So these were not any small issues that we were coming up against. So here we are. Here's all these beautiful things that we're learning. So not just beautiful things, now there's historical things that we're learning. Tilo, if you could unpack just a little bit the 3 most important things about being a Christian, about how you come in?
Yeah, in looking for what and I'm sorry, Abuna, we're running a little longer. We'll cut it at 12:15. But in looking for what the early church believed universally in all the churches founded by the apostles, remember that was where I started, the first things I came across were these. Baptism. Okay, now that's pretty central. How do I enter into Christ? That's core, that's not some peripheral issue. And they all believe the same thing. Baptism is what enters you into salvation, and infant baptism. That was universal. The next was, why do we meet every week? What's the central focal point? And how do I partake of Christ in my life? Well, it's communion. Well, that is universal. This is the body and blood of Christ and how you partake of him. And then what about how do I spend eternity with God? How am I going to be saved and live with him forever? And universally, it was a life of faithful dedication to him is how you will ultimately end up with him. Well, this was opposed irreconcilably to my beliefs as an evangelical.
Right. So those three things are going to be core, because here's what's happening now is Tilo and I are, at this point, sort of catechumens. We're not wanting to become Orthodox, but we're learning so much, and we learned at least three core things about baptism: that there is salvation through baptism, that the Eucharist, that it sustains us, that it is the body and blood of Christ, and that we participate in our salvation. So these are three things that were absolutely core against what we were taught. But we're still trying to go back and forth and visit our home church, our home Protestant church. We still have our family there that we love and want to connect with. And I remember, I'll never forget, this one time when we went to visit, and we realized every time they would offer communion in the churches that we were going to, they would say, this is grape juice and this is bread. And it is nothing magical about it. There is nothing going to happen when you take it. It is just to remember what Christ did for us. Now, that was the first time I ever realized, and I'm flashing back on my whole life, that they literally do this every week. Now, they might read the passage where Jesus broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples, but they would emphasize that there is no power in this. And I just realized that they were drawing the theological line in the sand, saying we reject the Holy Ancient Church. And I hadn't noticed that before. Then we went to baptism, his niece's baptism in a Protestant church, and they said the same thing, that this is just an outward profession of an inward decision. There's nothing that happens in baptism. And so I was thinking, I was like pleading in my mind, please stop drawing this line in the sand, because I didn't want to become Orthodox, to be honest with you. I wanted to learn the richness of Orthodoxy and take it back with me and share it with my Protestant family. But here, my Protestant family is drawing this hard line in the sand, and they're pushing me towards Orthodoxy if I wanted the truth. And so here we are, stuck in the middle, and what we had on a PowerPoint is, I wish that you could see this visual, because what we have is we have our old life and our old church and the old Protestantism over here that we had attended forever, and then we have Orthodoxy over here, and all the things we learned are true and that are core and that were handed down from the apostles. And here are Tilo and I stuck in the middle. We can't go towards Orthodoxy because there are things that are so important. Like I said, it's an abomination to put a priest between you and Christ. But we can't go back because they don't have the blood and body of the Eucharist. So here we are stuck in the middle. And what are we going to do? Are we going to reject what we know now as to be historically true, that these things, the Eucharist, the baptism, the life of holiness, are we going to reject that and go back to Protestantism? Or are we going to reject Protestantism? And it was just, we couldn't resolve it. And if there was any way to convey this place of terror of, are we becoming apostate? Are we being cut off from God, and are we going to be totally lost?
We literally, and not exaggerating, would wake up many mornings in terror. You know, like night terrors where you wake up just terrified? This was many, many mornings. This was how we would just wake up. We're becoming apostates. And I would literally have to logically talk myself down and say, okay, if these things which I've identified in orthodoxy are wrong, if they can't be so wrong that it's not Christian, because that would mean there was no church for 1,300 years, 1,200 years, because see, some of our practices and beliefs developed a little later. They didn't, believe it or not, the lines in the parking lot were not painted by St. Mark, okay? I know you might have heard that, and we tend to tie everything back. Of course, that came from the apostle, but some things developed a little later, and so, we're trying to identify these things, but if they're that wrong, can they be so wrong that it's not Christian? Well, that means there was no church, because everybody believed these things for 1,200 years. So I had to talk myself down, but I still wasn't convinced they weren't wrong, and that was a long road. That period in between, we think you're rowing out to go see something, and you keep rowing, and then all of a sudden you look and the shore's gone, and you can't go back. But you can't see the other shore, and you can't go on. There's nowhere to go to. And this is a horrible place to be.
Well, we got minus 9 seconds left. So I just want to say that obviously we did resolve these things. And we love this church, and we love being here, and it is absolutely priceless. That which we paid for with losing some of our friends, and we've been cut off from our family, but it's been well worth it. If you have any questions afterwards,
we will stay as long as you have questions. We will stay that long to answer them. We don't have a clock.
But thank you so much for welcoming us here today.
What a blessing to have two witnesses of our Orthodox faith here in our midst, people that went through a very long journey to come to what we see as the truth and what we see as the living church. So it's a blessing to have them. So thank you guys so much for coming. And they're going to be here. I encourage you, ask your questions, because not every day that you find people with an experience like this that can answer, because you're facing these things. Being in our Western culture, even our country, its way of thinking is a very Protestant way of thinking, and it influences us without us realizing it. So I think it's really good to ask your questions and find some answers from them. We thank you guys again. Let's stand up and pray.